On the day the gods chose for his destruction, Peter Hale ate his breakfast on the terrace of his condominium. This is the first sentence of Phillip Margolin's. I asked him yesterday, it is Margolin, it's not Margolin, what I thought. Of Phillip Margolin's fifth novel, The Burning Man. It is a sentence that is typical for thrillers in general, and Margolin's work in particular. Because it promises that something awful is going to happen. That Peter Hale will be a kind of victim, but at the same time it leaves a lot unclear. What will happen? And why will it happen? So it creates suspense, which is the heart and matter of thrillers. And The Burning Man, as the text on the flaps says, and I quote, is a fast-paced thriller packed with page-turning suspense. In American English, they also always know how to say these things. We in Holland don't have the vocabulary for this kind of talk about books. In the last few years, Phillip Margolin has become one of the most famous writers of legal thrillers in the United States. And whether we like it or not, the United States have a leading role, not only in politics, but also in the world of thrillers. Therefore, his books also became bestsellers in many other countries. He has been translated in 24 languages, including Korean, Bulgarian, and of course Dutch. And the documentation from his agent even says that his books have been translated in Latin American, a language and I'm a linguist, as the introductory said, have not come across before, but you learn every day. Phillip Margolin is not only a writer, but also a lawyer who seems to draw heavily upon his legal experiences in his novels. Already in the 7th grade, when he devoured many Perry Mason novels, he decided upon a legal career. And perhaps Mr. Margolin can tell us later if he also decided on a writing career that early. Since many years, Phillip Margolin has been a trial attorney in Portland, Oregon. And for the Dutch audience, we don't know always the exact legal terms, but trial attorney is something like strafpleiter in Dutch. So you can say he's the Moskovich of the United States, something like that. This is a joke I think you can't really appreciate, but perhaps somebody in the intermission will explain you. He is specializing in criminal law, and he represented more than 30 people charged with homicide. He has handled 12 death penalty cases, and he has saved all his clients from execution. And that must be a good recommendation, I guess. In 1978, Margolin's first novel was published, Heartstone, in Dutch, De Kroongetuige. His second novel in 1981 was The Last Innocent Man, De Laatste Onschuldige. And then it took 12 years, before his third novel could find its way to the readers. And I think it's not strange that the title was Gone but Not Forgotten, because the writer was nearly gone and perhaps also a little bit forgotten in the meantime. I think the title in Dutch even sounds better. Verdwenen maar niet vergeten. It's one of the few times that the Dutch title sounds, for me, better than the English title. With that book, in 1993, Phillip Margolin achieved bestseller status. And his earlier books were reprinted. It looks like he got a taste of it, because in 1995, After Dark was published, and in 1996, The Burning Man. After Dark is translated in Dutch as Als de duisternis valt, and The Burning Man is published this very month, what a coincidence, in Dutch as De Brandende Man. So you've got 5 books and some short stories, also a short novel called Rookgordijn, the present for the Dutch Mystery Month, in a little bit less than 20 years. So you can hardly say that Phillip Margolin is a very productive writer, but of course it's not the quantity that counts, but only the quality. I mentioned already the Perry Mason novels by Earl Stanley Gardner. And many people have read these books or they have seen the television series based on these novels. You can say they form a kind of standard for what is mostly called the legal thriller. The legal thriller is a subgenre of the thriller, the field of crime novels, which has become very popular in recent years. And Margolin's work is in some way comparable to the novels of Perry Mason, to the Perry Mason novels. Of course, you are inclined to say they are the novels by Perry Mason, but of course there's the novels by Earl Stanley Gardner, and Perry Mason is the main character, as you know. Because they are all about discovering the truth in a homicide case with an attorney as the main character, and many legal details giving the story a realistic flavor. But there are also many differences. The most important one is that the Perry Mason novels are written according to what is mostly called a formula. They have the same main character, and the structure of all the novels is more or less the same. They can be compared with so-called puzzle detectives or whodunits by Agatha Christie and others. They offer a puzzle or a mystery which must be solved, and will be solved by the detective, or in case of the legal thrillers, the attorney. I've got here an old Perry Mason novel, and also the titles are nearly always the same. There's always the case of, in this case, the lonely heiress. And of course you see a very seductive lady there, and you know what will happen to her. Margolin doesn't write these so-called formula thrillers. And I'm glad he does not, because formulas often produce rather predictable books. I think Phillip Margolin's work can be characterized as a combination of the legal thriller and the psychological thriller. In all the novels, the psychological development of the characters is a major point of attention. One of these psychological aspects concerns the moral dilemmas or ethical problems many attorneys are confronted with. For instance, in The Last Innocent Man, defense attorney David Nash is practically unbeatable in the courtroom, like Mr. Margolin himself, I think. Most of his clients are guilty, and he knows it, but he succeeds in getting them free. Then he starts asking himself questions. In fact, the main question is, am I doing a good job? Am I doing a good job for society? What is the cost of each victory, each rapist or each murderer set free? And the dilemma becomes even stronger and more personal when he falls in love with the wife of a client who is also a lawyer and who is accused of murder. When David Nash would lose the trial, he could start a new life with the wife of the defendant. I think we are curious whether Mr. Margolin himself has been confronted with a dilemma like that. Not the love case, I think, but you know somebody is guilty and you have to defend him. That's your task. That's what you're paid for. And what do you do? How are you develop your moral ideas about such a case? Another psychological aspect is that the defense attorneys often get mixed up emotionally in a case. They get personally involved, sometimes because of a sexual relation or an intended sexual relation. I wonder myself whether all these relations between deputy attorneys, officieren van justitie, and judges, defense attorneys and defendants, or wives of defendants, are realistic. In the American legal system, everybody seems to do it with everybody. Is that true? Or is it only a kind of trick for the writer to make the plot more interesting because of the emotional aspects which accompany all these relations? Perhaps Mr. Margolin can also satisfy my curiosity at this point. In many ways, Phillip Margolin's books can be compared with those of the two other great names in this genre, Scott Turow and John Grisham. As far as I can see, Margolin presents a well-documented view on the legal system, with not too many legal details, which could only obstruct the story. His language is direct and nearly without what I call the metaphorical virus, which has affected many crime novelists. Especially the dialogues in the cross-examinations are very lively, and in my opinion they form the best part of his books. His plots are interesting, and Margolin has built a lot of suspense, sometimes by unexpected twists in the plot, sometimes by the use of so-called cliffhangers. For instance, in The Burning Man, I read a few short paragraphs to show how these work. For instance, here at the end of a chapter, it says, "Suddenly, Booth's face lit up. 'I got it,' he said. 'I got something solid, something that will prove I'm not lying.' Then, of course, you don't read here what will prove the fact that he's not lying. That's much further in the book. That's how these damn thriller writers manipulate the reader. And, for instance, also on page 266, this is the deputy district attorney. Becky sat up, open-mouthed. Then she rummaged through the police reports until she found what she had wanted. A surge of energy coursed through her as she read it. When she was done, she placed several calls. The people with whom she spoke confirmed her conclusion. And of course, no conclusion here. It is clear how the process works. The people in the book know something, or they have discovered something, but we, the poor readers, must wait. So we are pressed to read on and on. The writer just suspends the information he wants to give. Although it may seem easy, I can assure you it is not. And Phillip Margolin is a master in applying this process in such a way that his novels indeed become the page-turners his publishers promise.
Take this one, Rene?
Yes.
Good evening. Rene told you how I decided to become a lawyer, and it's true. Sometime when I was around the age of 12, because of an overdose of Perry Mason books, I made up my mind that when I grew up I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer, not just a lawyer, but specifically a criminal defense lawyer. And if you asked me at any point after that decision, what are you going to do when you grow up, I would have said, I'm going to be a criminal defense lawyer. Now, if you asked me at any time till I was 30, do you think that you will ever publish a novel? I would have told you absolutely not. And that would not have been false modesty. It would have been because I read, and I've always read a lot. I still read several books a week, mostly fiction. And I was just in awe of writers, and I was convinced that I didn't have the ability or the talent to write a book. So I really didn't try. And now that I'm a published writer, I've had a lot of opportunity to meet other writers. And the thing that interests me is I found that they're not any more creative or imaginative than a lot of people I know who are not published writers. The big difference is that they were able to get over the psychological hurdle of believing that they couldn't do it. Most of the published writers I know are people who said, I'm going to write, and sat down on their backside and wrote. And quite frankly, I think the most important part of a writer's anatomy isn't his brain where the ideas come from or the hands, it's your backside. Just actually plumping yourself down and deciding that this is what you're going to do. Another problem I had was that I had never met a writer. Writers were very, very mysterious people. You know, as a lawyer, if I have a question about search and seizure or confession, I can walk out of my office and go to the right or the left, and there are lawyers all over the place that I can discuss problems with. But in the city of Portland, which actually now has quite a good number of authors, still, if you take the actual number, it's quite small. And I am the first published author I ever met. Up until, it's true, I never had met anyone so I never had this opportunity to talk to somebody and say, how do you do this? So what I thought I would do tonight is two things. First of all, I'm sure there's somebody in the audience who is thinking of writing a novel but hasn't yet got to the point where they've convinced themselves that they could actually do it. And so I like to use these talks when I speak to people about writing, like self-help talks, to try to get you pumped up so that you will run out of here and say, if this guy could do it, I could certainly do it. And more than that, though, I frequently get these people who come up to me and say, I have a great idea for a book. Would you like to write it? And then I always, tell them, well, why don't you write it? I don't have the time. And I'm really not sympathetic to that position because I've written 4 of my 5 books with a full-time law practice, helping to raise 2 children with my wife and doing a bunch of other things. So what I thought I would do is to explain how you write a novel if you have a full-time job, so that none of you in this audience at least will be able to make that excuse. So I'm going to sort of walk you through how I got published, how I figured out the difference between publishable and unpublishable writing, and then how I actually do it. It's a little quickie course on how to write a novel. So after this course, I expect everybody in this audience to be back here in about 2 years talking to groups of people. The first thing I want to say about writing, which is really mental attitude, is really important. Writing, first of all, it is hard work. It's a learned skill. It's like tennis or swimming. I think for some reason people think that writers get up in the morning and they fix themselves a snifter of brandy and put on a smoking jacket, and then they get a pipe or something, they put on some classical music, and they close their eyes, and then the muse strikes them, and they are filled with all these brilliant ideas. And I wish it worked that way. I mean, it would be really nice to just be able to sit down and get all these ideas and get the work done in about an hour and then play for the rest of the year. But really, you have to work at it. And the big thing is to never be discouraged, because the first time you write a book may be horrible. And the second book you write might be twice as bad. But eventually, you're going to get better and better, and it might be your 4th or 5th one that actually clicks. So don't give up. That's really important. Don't think just because the first time you try something and it doesn't work that it's no good. Now, I got into writing in a really weird way. After college, I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa for 2 years, and then I came back to law school. And my last 2 years in law school, I taught junior high school in the South Bronx in New York, and then finished up in the evening. So I had very little time to eat or breathe, let alone write any books. But my last summer in school, I had a free summer because I had a job already, which meant I just had to get D's in my classes to pass and get my law degree. And so I didn't have to worry too much about schoolwork. And I was able to take off from work because I knew I had a job coming in about 2 months, so I wasn't worried about that. So it was a free summer, and what was I going to do? And I decided to try to spend it solving what was, for me, one of life's great mysteries, which was how do those guys fill up 500 pages with words? Because I don't know about you, but when I would read these books, and I would say, my God, how can you write 500 pages? So that was my task during the summer, to write something that was more than 25 pages long. I mean, it wasn't to say anything to the world or to try to get published. And what I did was I took a loose leaf notebook or a spiral notebook and a pen, and I went out into Central Park in New York City, and I started writing a novel that was based on my African experiences. And occasionally people would come up to me and they'd say, what are you doing? And I would sort of blush a little and say I was writing a novel, and they would be awestruck. Fortunately, no one ever asked me, do you have a contract for this book? But my advice to you is, if you really want to impress people, get a notebook and a pen and sit in a public square and write. And if people ask you what you're doing, say you're writing a novel. They'll be very impressed. Anyway, I started working on this book, and then I moved to Oregon. And my job was clerking for the chief judge of the Oregon Court of Appeals. And what a law clerk does is to review briefs. Now, if you were in an American court and you were convicted, say, of murder, and you felt that you didn't get a fair shake, that your trial somehow was unfair, you'd hire an appellate lawyer, and he would go through the transcript of the trial. The transcript is word for word everything that was said at your trial. And your lawyer would try to find mistakes that the judge had made. And these mistakes are called assignments of error, and they're put in what is labeled a brief. And the briefs are then sent up to the Court of Appeals, and the clerks help the judges by reading through the briefs and digesting what's in them, among other things. And these briefs are usually just that. They're usually very short. They're 20 to 40 pages. In fact, in Oregon, if you want to write a brief that is 50 pages or longer, you have to get special permission from the court. Well, these clerking jobs usually last a year. They're not supposed to be permanent jobs. And the next case I would have handled, had I stayed at the court, was one of the Payton Allen murder cases, one of the appeals in that case. And the brief in that case was 800 pages long. And I looked at this brief and I said, my God, I said, what in the world is this? Because I'd never seen any brief in a civil or criminal case anywhere near this long. And coming from New York, I'd never heard of Payton Allen. So I went with the brief to some of the other clerks, and they said, oh, that's Payton Allen. And they began talking about this case. And in my personal opinion, the Payton Allen case is the single most interesting and complex murder case in American history. Now, fortunately, it was an Oregon case, and we only had a handful of writers when I moved out in 1970. No one had ever, there weren't, and none of them were writing legal thrillers. So if this case had taken place in New York City or Los Angeles, probably there would be 50 miniseries about it by now and 200 books. But fortunately for me, I was the only one who was really thinking about it. And to inject a little sex and violence into the talk, I'll give you just a brief overview of this very bizarre case. The case, by the way, was in the courts for 20 years. It wasn't solved, if it was solved at all, for 8 years after the murders. There was hypnotism involved, very bizarre stuff. But basically, a boy and a girl went out on a Friday night date in the late 1950s and were never seen alive again. The next morning, the boy's body was found in a car in Lover's Lane, and he had been brutally murdered, stabbed and beaten with a blunt instrument. Really, really bloody murder. The girl was nowhere to be found. About 6 weeks later, after a tremendous search, her body was found 40 miles away from the boy's body, and she'd been raped and strangled, and her body was found in a culvert by the side of the Sunset Highway, which is a highway that leads from Portland out to the coast. At the time of the murder, there were no suspects and no clues, except for a pair of women's sunglasses. They were rhinestone-studded glasses that had been found near but not at the site of the boy's murder. So the police didn't even know whether this was a clue. They just found a rat-tailed comb, these glasses, and some lipstick, some distance, but around the area where the boy's body was found. Well, 8 years later, I guess it was about 6 years later, a convict who had been sent to the penitentiary by the detective who had worked on the case got friendly. He got friendly with the detective, and he was talking with him, and he mentioned that he had dated a girl named Nikki Essex. Now, the police had traced the glasses to Nikki Essex at the time of the murder. She was a teenager. She said her purse had been stolen a couple of weeks before the murder. She didn't know anything at all about these killings, and the police had no reason to doubt that. Well, this convict said that Nikki had told her mother something that only someone who was at the scene of the murders would know. So many years later, the police went to re-interview her. And she was a very good citizen. She had been a bit of a delinquent back in her high school days, but by the time they got in touch with her, she was married, she had a child. She said, I'll be glad to cooperate with you, but I don't know anything. So they said, well, sometimes if you see something really horrible, your mind blocks it out. So would you be willing to let us hypnotize you to see if we can extract a memory if you did have one that was blocked out? She said, sure, but I don't know anything. There were several hypnosis sessions. She didn't say anything that helped the police. So they said, look, would you come down to the state mental hospital down in Salem? We have someone there who can give you sodium amytal, truth serum. Maybe that'll unblock you if there is a block. She said, I'll come, but I don't know anything. Under the truth serum, after being interrogated quite a few times by the police through the person who's doing the hypnosis, she told a story about being at a party with 3 boys and going on a run to get more beer. And she said that when they were going for the beer, they had run into Larry Payton, Beverly Allen, the 2 victims. There had been a drag race. Larry Payton had forced the boys' car off. These kids were all in a gang. They got very mad after their car crashed, and they got another car and went looking. And she said that they found the boy and girl up in Lover's Lane. She got mad when her date, Robert Brahm, one of the 3 boys, went running off into the woods after Beverly Allen, and she ran down the hill where the glasses were found, was hitchhiking 15 minutes later when she was picked up by the boys with Beverly Allen in the back seat, and Larry Payton wasn't there, and they dropped her off at home, and that was all she knew. Based just on that testimony, the 3 men, Carl and Ed Jorgensen and Braun, were all indicted for murder. It was the only evidence they had was the hypnotized testimony. Right before the case was to be tried, a witness popped up. And in real life, I could tell you 30 homicides plus thousands of other cases over the 25 years. In real life, you rarely have a second suspect in a case. It's very unusual to have an alternate theory of the crime. But this person said that he had been in North Portland, far away from where the boys were at the party, and he wanted to get laid. He wanted to have sex. And this was 6 weeks after the murder of the boy, Larry Payton. And the government's theory was that both people had been killed at the same time, or within 72 hours of each other. And he said 6 weeks later, he had been told there was a gang keeping a woman, a sex slave, in a basement, a gang that had no connection with the boys on trial, men on trial at this point, and that he had gone over and seen this woman strangled to death in the basement when she wouldn't have sex with one of the gang members, and that 2 days later he saw the picture of the girl, Beverly Allen, in the paper, and this was the person he'd seen strangled. And he said it was definitely not Carl Jorgensen, Ed Jorgensen, or Robert Braun. Time of death became really important. There were some very bizarre ways that they used to determine time of death, but the most bizarre was digging up the corpse of Beverly Allen to try to fit a broken fingernail that had been found in the front seat of the car to her finger. This is 8 years after the corpse had been buried, to try to establish that if the fingernail fit, that that had been snapped off shortly before death, and therefore she had to have died within 72 hours of having the fingernail snapped off. There's a bunch of other very bizarre things that went into establishing time of death. The trial, there were 3 separate trials. There were different verdicts. Some of the men were found guilty, some not guilty on the same evidence. Years went by with this case in the courts. Other witnesses were found to back up the story of the strangulation in the basement. In any event, and this, what I'm telling you, is just a teeny-weeny part of this case. And I just became fascinated with it, and I've never been fascinated with a case that wasn't mine before or since. This is about the only one that I've ever, for some reason, got interested in. And so I started taking notes about it. You've probably forgotten my African novel by now, with all this, the murders and stuff, but I finished it. It took me 2 years, and it was about 187 pages long, so I had done my job. I'd actually gotten more than 25 pages written. But there was one problem with this book that kept it from ever being published. And this is one of the things you need to know if you're going to be a writer. The book had no plot. Now, it may seem odd to you, but most people who try to write a book for the first time write something that's autobiographical. And you might think people will write out and pay $25 to read about your life, but they won't. So one of the things I learned from this first book, which was really very bad, not worthy of being published, was that you have to have a plot. So I decided, even though I hadn't written a very good book, that I liked the process of writing. I enjoyed doing it, and I was having a lot of fun with it. And so I decided to write a second book. Now, the first book was based on real things that happened to me when I was in Africa for my 2 years in the Peace Corps. So I decided to write the second one and have it all made up, something that was just made up. And I wrote what was probably the worst mystery that's ever been written. Nobody has ever seen this. My wife hasn't even seen the book. It's under 24-hour-a-day guard with Pinkertons, so that no one ever will see the book. And in case you think I'm just being modest and it's really a great book, I will tell you that the first line is, "It was a dark and stormy night." And does anyone want to guess who the murderer was? It's the butler. So when I say it's bad, this is really bad. Again, I wrote the book, and it turned out also to be 187 pages. And I wondered about that. Why were these two books 187 pages? And I posited this question to a group of lawyers down in Eugene, Oregon about 2 years ago. And a week after the speech, I got a letter in the mail from a professor of law at the University of Oregon saying that the homicide code in California, code for homicide, is 187. So those of you who are fans of the supernatural, you can make what you want out of that. In any event, the problem with this book, though, wasn't only that it had a horrible plot, because it did have a plot, but that the characters were totally unbelievable. My main detective was a great chess grandmaster who never left his room and solved the mystery by getting clues from his female sidekick, who was 6 foot tall and knew karate. And if you've ever seen the Avengers show with Diana Rigg on television, you know exactly what she looked like. And so what I realized that these particular characters were so unbelievable that nobody would relate to them. And this is the second thing. If you're going to write, your characters have to be believable people. You've got to give them histories. You've got to give them some sort of a quirk. Maybe they have a limp, that something about them that makes them different from the other people in the book and recognizable. And they also have to be people that your reader is concerned about. Why would anyone care what a grandmaster who lives in his room does? The breakthrough that I had as a writer occurred in 1974, when I had a short story accepted for publication for the first time. And I remember to this day, I came to my office, and there was a gray letter. And I had, every once in a blue moon, I'd send a short story out, and they were all rejected, and rightfully so. And this letter, I remember it was a gray envelope with black writing. It was from Mike Shane Mystery Magazine. And I had sent them the short story 3 or 4 months before and forgotten about it. And I assumed it was another rejection. And they asked me if they could have the honor of paying me $65 to print this story. And my first reaction was that these were really stupid people. Because if they had negotiated, I would have paid them twice the amount to get the book and the story into print. But being a lawyer, I kept quiet and kept the money. But the thing I learned from this story, what I did immediately, I took out all my other short stories and I reread them to find out why was this story accepted while every other one was rejected. And I found out two things. In the story, the main character, it's the middle of the summer, it's very hot. He's lost his job, he's been fired, so he's very depressed, and his wife has just left him. And so he's at home, he's got nothing to do, and across the street is a vacant house, and into the house moves a very beautiful blonde. And the name of the short story is The Girl in the Yellow Bikini, which I always liked because it was a pulp mystery magazine. And this girl comes out and sunbathes in the yellow bikini. So at first, he starts to watch her just as a voyeur because she's very attractive. But after a while, because he's getting bored, he decides that he's going to play a game. He's going to try to find out everything he can about her without meeting her. And in the course of doing this, there's a double murder, there's blackmail, and there are a bunch of other events that happen. And I learned two things that this short story had that none of my other stories or any of my novels had. First, I had a very believable and appealing main character. Now, most people at some time have had lost a job or been unemployed. And most people have had some romantic problem. Maybe it's not a divorce, but you've had a boyfriend or girlfriend you've broken up with. So people reading the short story would be interested in this person's problems because they could relate to them. Secondly, the story had a plot, but it wasn't linear. You couldn't figure out what was going to happen at the end of the story or even the middle of the story by reading what happened at the beginning of the story. And the plot, instead of moving like this, was going this way, this way, this way, and this way, constantly turning back on itself. And so that story gave me the framework for all of the books that I've written ever since, as well as giving me self-confidence that I could actually write something that someone would buy. So I immediately set out to write a novel, a serious attempt at a novel that would be published. And, of course, I'd been taking notes for about 4 or 5 years at this time about the Payton Allen murders, and I decided to fictionalize that case. And that eventually became Heartstone, which I believe is called Key Witness in the Dutch translation. Now, the way I write my books is the same way I wrote when I was doing it with a full-time job. And what I thought I'd do is explain where I got the idea for The Burning Man, and then show you how that idea went from an idea into a final manuscript. The idea comes from two places. First, I actually handled a case that is the basis for it. In the mid-'80s, I had a murder case involving a horrible hatchet murder that occurred in a small town in eastern Oregon. And I've had 30 homicides. 2 of them involved people who were convicted of murder when I was given the case to handle on appeal, but who were innocent. In other words, who were actually serving life in prison but had not done those crimes. They were very emotional for me, very, very tough cases for me to take. It took about 4 years in both instances to save the person from prison to get them out. And I always thought this particular case would make a very interesting story because it was a very bizarre interrogation of the key witness or the defendant in which a police officer took advantage of my client's low IQ to convince him that he had psychic powers. And he convinced this fellow that he had psychic powers that would enable him to project his mind into the mind of the killer of this young girl and solve the murder. And this fellow, during a 7-hour interrogation, made all these guesses about what actually had happened, and a lot of them turned out to be true in many instances because 4 or 5 hours before making the observation, the detective had fed the information that came out later on to him. And I was just fascinated by this, what was in a certain way hypnotism. So there sat that idea, but I couldn't figure out how to make it into a plot. Additionally, I love Joseph Conrad. And Conrad, in 2 of his books, Outcast of the Island and Lord Jim, starts off the book with a fellow who's very high and mighty as his main character, and in a chapter or 2 just cuts his legs off, destroys the person completely, brings him from high up in society into the depths. And the rest of the book is how the person deals with his disgrace, and we try to see, can he regain his dignity. And I always loved that plot idea. And my advice to you is if you're going to rip somebody off, you're going to steal the plot, steal from someone who's a really good writer. So I always wanted to use that plot, and what I did was I got an idea for taking a young yuppie attorney, a real self-centered jerk, wiping him out in the beginning by having him mess up a major case, and then have him exiled to a small town in the desert in eastern Oregon, have the rest of the book show how he regains his dignity and becomes an adult through his representation of a mentally handicapped man in a death penalty case. And so that's the idea. Now, it took me about 3 or 4 years, actually more than 3 or 4 years. In that case, it was like from 1984, about 10 years to get the idea for that book. A real good piece of advice. If you want to publish a book, do not rush. And a lot of people think they have to write the book by Christmas. You have to take your time. It took me 3 years to get the idea for the ending for Gone But Not Forgotten. It took me about 4 or 5 years to actually start writing Heartstone. I don't start writing a book until I've got the ending, until I know who did it and how they're going to be caught. And I think whether you're writing mysteries or you're writing literary fiction, you should know how your book's going to end before you start writing. There's nothing worse than spending 4 or 5 years working on a book and getting 99% of it done and not knowing how to end it. And the other thing is, you think about this, you can write how many books have you read that were really good at the beginning and got you really excited and then had a lousy ending? The ending is what you remember. If a book's really good for 99% of it, but it has a bad ending, that's what stays with the reader, and they're not going to like that book. On the other hand, you can have an average or mediocre book, but if the ending is terrific, the person who's reading that's going to like that book. If they really are floored by the ending, that's what's going to stick with them. So I always try to think of the ending before I write a single word. Now, how do I write the books with a full-time job? Okay, I take my time, I think of my ending. As soon as I've got the ending down, who did it and how are they going to be caught, I work backwards. Where are the clues going to be that are going to lead the reader to be able to figure out who did it, and where are the red herrings going to be that are going to distract the reader? Who are the characters going to be who are involved in this particular case? Then, once I've got that, I do an outline. Now, the outline is really important if you have another job. What I do is I talk my way through the whole book. Now, I do this on a computer, word processor, but basically, chapter 1, okay, John meets Mary. Who's John, who's Mary? She's a lawyer, he's a judge, whatever. Chapter 2, John and Mary fall in love, and I keep on going all the way through till I get to the end of the book. Now, why do I do this? 2 reasons. First, it helps me to work out plotting problems. Think about this. Let's say I didn't do the outline, I just start writing, and the ending is that the bad guy gets caught because he's right-handed. Okay, and I'm 300 pages into the book, and I realize that in order to grab that candelabra from the mantelpiece, he had to be left-handed. I've written for a year, and I have to go back and rewrite the whole thing. If I do it in an outline, I can catch a lot of the problems before they get too big for me. More important if you have a job. When I was in trial, say doing a murder case, I might be 2 months between working on the book. What I would do is work mostly on the weekends. And this is just the other thing. I would get up Saturdays and Sundays very early and write till about 11. And if you think about that, you can accomplish an awful lot. That gives you 8 hours a weekend. And if you write 1 page a day, you can write 365 pages in a year. If you write 2 pages a day, that's War and Peace. So you don't need a lot of time to get a pretty big amount of work, actual work done. The other thing you have to remember with this is if you don't have a contract, you have until you die to finish your book. So you don't have to rush your book. You don't have to write your whole book in 1 year. You can spend 5 years or 10 years. If you don't have a contract, you don't have a deadline, why rush? What you're trying to do, especially if you haven't published, is write the best book that you can write. Now with this outline, let's say I couldn't get to the book for a month or 2 months because I'm in trial and I have to use my weekends in order to prepare my case. Finally, I get a free weekend, and I've written 200 pages. If I want to get back in the flow of my book, I'm going to have to read those 200 pages unless I have an outline. Now, if I have to read the 200 pages because I don't have an outline, that's going to take up the whole weekend, and I'm going to lose my writing time. If I have my outline, I can read up until the point that's about 2 chapters from where I stopped, then read the text, get right back in and get some good writing done. Another thing that's really important if you have a full-time job is the way you do your first drafts. when I write a first draft, I am not interested in doing anything except getting the ideas out of my head and onto paper. I don't care about quality. I just want to get it from page 1 to the end. And I know my first draft's going to be lousy. Now, why do I do that? Because I have a job, full-time job, and I don't have the time to mess around with quality initially. You know, I heard J.D. Salinger used to spend a whole day working on each sentence to get the sentence just perfect. So each word was the best word to put in the sentence. Well, if you're J.D. Salinger and you're not doing anything else, that's cool. But if you have a full-time job, you can't spend the whole day on each sentence because then you will die before you finish your book. So I call this sort of the vomit theory of writing, which I love to use that term right after people have eaten dinner. But you get everything out of your head and onto the paper and don't worry about what it looks like. And so what you're going to end up with is really a 500-page outline. And then the real trick is rewrite, rewrite, rewrite. And every page in one of my books has been rewritten probably 12 to 13 or 14 times. And the reason for that is nothing you write the first time is going to be good. You may think it is, because you wouldn't write the sentence if you didn't think it was good. But if you put it away in a drawer and you come back to it a week later and reread it, you'll find out just how bad it is. And what you have to keep on doing is going at your work with a very objective eye. If you want to be a good writer, you can't have any ego involvement in your work. You have to be willing to take criticism and listen to criticism. You have to be willing to take your best stuff and destroy it and throw it out if it interferes with the book. I had a good example of this, which shows a little bit about what editors do. In the first draft of Gone But Not Forgotten, my heroine, Betsy Tannenbaum, was married to Rick, her husband. They were living together in the house, and they had a child that was living with them. And as the book progressed, Betsy and Rick started having arguments. And eventually, about halfway to three-quarters of the way through, Rick leaves Betsy and then comes back in later on in the book. Now, I thought the domestic scenes, which were about 20 pages apiece, were the best writing I did in the book. And I had a lot of feedback from a lot of people that these domestic scenes were terrific and made the book much, much better than a normal thriller might be. And so the book was eventually sold to Doubleday, and I was very excited, and I was going to have my first conference with my editor, David Gerner. And I really couldn't wait to hear what he had to say, and we introduced ourselves. This was by telephone because he was in New York and I was 3,000 miles away in Oregon. And I'm pumped up to get going on the editing, and the first words out of David's mouth are, "Rick's gonna go." I said, what? He says, "That Rick. Can't Betsy be divorced or a widow? Does he have to be in the book?" And of course, we got into a real intellectual Donnybrook. We were mad at each other about whether these domestic scenes should stay in. Now, when you are listening to criticism, you really have to not become defensive about it. And what happened was for 4 months we were arguing about it. I agreed with 90% of what he wanted me to do as far as changes, but not on this. And my agent backed me up, and everybody else said that he was wrong and I was right. I read another book called Griff Stockley's Expert Testimony, or Expert Witness. And I was reading this book. It was a murder mystery. And the hero is a single parent with a 16-year-old daughter. And the best written and some of the most interesting scenes were the scenes where he helps his daughter with problems that she has that have nothing to do with the murder. And they were very well written and very interesting, but I found I was skim reading them when I got to them because I wanted to find out who did it. And all of a sudden, a little light went on in my head. And I said, that's what David's talking about. I'm writing a thriller. My job is to put my reader on a roller coaster. And from the minute the book opens to the minute it ends, the reader should be going at 100 miles an hour. And what happened with these domestic scenes was that the book would go dun, 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 and then it hit them and go bloop, bloop, bloop. And then it'd be gone and go dun, 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 and it'd go bloop. So they were like literary speed bumps. They were slowing up the action. And I realized that's what David was trying to tell me. that these were slowing down the action. I was writing a thriller, and the purpose of writing a thriller is to entertain your reader and really get the action going. So thank God for computers. As soon as I realized this, it was a weekend, I took every scene with Rick and took it out in the computer, put it into a save file, separate file, reread the whole book without Rick in it, and then rewrote it in 2 days. And what happens is I do have Rick in the book. He's in one scene at the beginning where you get to meet him and find out the relationship. He's living outside. They're already separated. He's mentioned a couple of times, and then he does come back in later on in the book. But all of the problems that I had were solved. Now, the point of this is listen to other people's criticism. You don't have to accept it, but you should never get upset. If someone tells you, if an editor tells me, this section stinks, my reaction is not, oh yeah, my reaction is, why do you think it stinks? And you should always be willing to take out what you consider really good, because those scenes were good. They were very well written, they worked beautifully internally, but if you want to help your book, you sometimes have to take those good scenes out. So the first draft, just get it done, and don't rush it. And then when you're finished with it, then spend your time on rewriting. I would usually do that if I had a vacation where I had maybe a couple of days off where I could work in a row. That's when I would spend my time doing very heavy-duty editing. And that's basically the way I do it on the weekends. And what's our plan now? Are we stopping for... Okay.
And then you continue to the second half, in which you have a talk together, and Rene will take questions from the audience.
Okay, what I really encourage you, again, one of the reasons I love to do this is I never had a chance to ask an author any of the questions I would have loved to do, so I'm really hard to embarrass. I encourage questions. It's fun for me to try to answer them. So anything you can think of that you want to, except for those rumors about me and Madonna, other than that, I will take any questions that you have, and after the intermission.
If you have 15 minutes, just a short intermission, and Mr. Margolin is going to read some see the feedback. Is there a lot?
There are no written questions, but I invite the audience to ask questions orally, perhaps in a later stage, but to break the ice, I'll ask a few questions myself. And the first is about the way you work. You said you must have your ending, you have an outline, a complete outline of the story. You have developed the plot completely before you start writing. But isn't that boring for you as a writer? Because you know what's going to happen, you only have to fill in the story. There are no surprises for yourselves. There's no suspense for yourself. For me, I have quite another way of writing. For me, it's often a surprise what's going to happen in the next chapter, because I don't know it in advance. I develop it from the way I write, from what happens to people, the way they interact. Something happens, and that promotes the story.
Well, the stories have a life of their own, and the outlines are really just a sort of a roadmap for me. What I have found really interesting is while I write, strange things happen to my characters and to the plot. And a lot of times, I think I know where the story's going to go, and I have the actual story that ends up is completely different from the outline.
But why then an outline?
Well, the outline gives me a roadmap. I can always change the outline. You should never be straitjacketed by your outline, but at least it gives me a roadmap. In The Last Innocent Man, for instance, my second book, I had this outline and I wrote the story. When I got finished with it, I realized it wasn't complicated enough. And I didn't like it. So in the final draft of The Last Innocent Man, or the first draft of The Last Innocent Man, the murderer isn't even in the book. And I rewrote the whole book and changed everything around. You find out that, the outline, the characters are one-dimensional. It's John and Mary. So, you write John and Mary meet each other. John and Mary fall in love. John and Mary get married. Well, that sounds like a pretty easy story to write. But what happens if, after the first chapter where you develop the personalities of John and Mary, you've developed two people who could never like each other? So then you have to decide, boy, what am I going to do? Either I'm going to change the plot around, or I'm going to make John or Mary a little bit different. And, it's when you just say my character's John and my character's Mary, that's different from actually writing and developing the character and creating a three-dimensional world. So fortunately for me, it doesn't get boring because the outline and the actual book are frequently quite different. And I've talked to other writers about this, thinking that maybe it was just me, and they said, no, this happens quite frequently to them, that their story gets out of hand. I have characters that pop up that I didn't know existed, and all sorts of situations occur that I never thought were going to happen. So
a lot of surprises.
Yeah, for me too. So
then I've quite another question. Of course, different countries have different legal systems. And I think it's striking that nearly all legal thrillers come from the United States. And is this because of the American legal system? Are you dependent on the way the legal system works? Could you write a story, for example, which is set in the Netherlands, where we don't have juries, where defense attorneys in general do not hire investigators or detectives? Would that be possible?
Sure. I mean, Rumpole of the Bailey isn't set in the United States. Those are legal, thrillers with a touch of humor, but they're no different from what I write or what the other American writers write. There's no, what happens in a courtroom is conflict. That you're really exploring some really serious things, taking of a human life. What kind of person could do that? Interrelationships between the person who's trying to help the individual on trial and the person who's prosecuting. I don't see why you couldn't set a legal thriller in any country in the world.
But isn't the fact that in the American legal system the juries play an important part, isn't that in nearly all thrillers that is also a point which is given much attention to?
I don't see why that's the same. What a jury does is try to evaluate the truthfulness of the people who are testifying and try to decide what happened so they can see whether the person on trial did the crime they're accused of. I don't know why that would be any less emotionally trying for the three judges that you have in a Dutch court. They might be more sophisticated because they've sat on a number of cases, but I'm sure that Dutch judges who are sitting on a case where there really are some questions of fact would be very troubled and would go through the same emotional throes that a jury would go through. So,
but I think that if you have more parties in the courtroom, there are more types of interactions going on, which gives you all possibilities. And as far as I don't know, I'm the American legal system very well, but what I read from legal thrillers is that also the deputy attorneys, of the district attorneys and the defense attorneys, they try to manipulate, to influence the juries in a certain way. I don't know the Dutch system at all, except for some minor introductions that I've had to it over the last few days, but I would assume that a Dutch attorney, in a case where there are real questions of guilt or innocence, would be trying to use everything he or she could to convince the judges to go their way. And remember, a lot of the things that happen in my books and in some of the legal thrillers don't really happen in a real courtroom. They're put in there for dramatic effect. So why not have a judge who's taking a bribe?
Maybe that doesn't happen in the Dutch system.
No, not in the Dutch system. No.
But if you're writing a book, you could have that happen. Why not have the prosecutor having an affair with the defense attorney?
Aha.
So,
that's the point.
you know, if you're writing a book, you can put in things that don't really necessarily happen in real life. As long as they could happen, you could do it. And so you could spice up a Dutch trial.
Yeah. Even a Dutch trial. But in Holland, what we know from the American legal system comes mainly from television series like L.A. Law and from the press coverage of such famous cases as the O.J. Simpson case, or perhaps in the near future the Paula Jones versus Bill Clinton case. How representative are they for the American court cases?
Well, they're not. I mean, I can tell you from having tried hundreds of cases, they're really boring. And one of the things I try to do in my books, if I wrote a very realistic legal thriller, you'd all fall asleep. Nothing happens in court usually. I mean, when I had a 2-month-long drug trial several years ago, and we spent several weeks with the witnesses being clerks in motels who would be called to the stand and go through phone records for 6 or 7 hours. And if you don't think I had a gun to my head several times and had to have the hand pulled down, it's agonizingly painful on occasions to sit through one of these cases. Even murder cases, they're interesting for the lawyer a lot because you have to be listening all the time, you have to pay attention, but the thrillers are not realistic. They raise, for instance, in my books I try to raise ethical and moral dilemmas that are sometimes experienced, but in the average case, they're not the way they are in the books. Also, the cases that usually get played up in the press, like the Simpson case, are totally unrepresentative. That case has nothing to do with the legal system. It was a ridiculous case. So
that's how we get our image of.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. It's also how the people in the United States get their image of what the court system's like in the United States, and it's really unfortunate because the media is misrepresenting the way the system really works. If you ask for instance, if you ask people, you know, how many psycho serial killers are freed on technicalities every week in the United States, you probably say, well, 10 a day. In reality, if you talk to any district attorney's office in the United States, they'll tell you they have a 95% conviction rate. And of the 5% that they don't convict, there's a certain percentage where the police made a mistake and the wrong person's on trial, so they should be acquitted. So the system works very well in a very boring and, you know, mechanical way most of the time, but that's not news. So what gets played up is the 1 or 2 spectacular cases where something goes wrong. And it's unfortunate. It's great for me because people think the system's so great and they're going to run out and buy my books, but in real life it's not so good because I think people don't get a real picture of what's going on. And as I say, it's not just in the Netherlands, it's also in the United States where people scream for legal reform because of one case that doesn't really represent what's going on.
Talking about realism, in your novels nearly all women are very beautiful, especially the ones working in the legal system. I would say they were made for Hollywood.
That's true. All American women lawyers are beautiful. I think I've ever seen.
But all the descriptions seem to me a little bit stereotypical. And my question is, when you are a woman and you want to work in the American legal system, do you have to be beautiful? Is that a condition sine qua non, or?
No, I mean, this is artistic license. I have.
What is it? I'm sorry.
Artistic license. I usually, as a matter of fact, I get criticized about that a lot, and I didn't realize people were going to comment on it. I usually try to create a character that I give the characteristics that are necessary for the story, for the plot line, and it just so happens that having really attractive women has been necessary. For instance, in After Dark, it's sort of a Beauty and the Beast type thing, and the attractiveness of Abigail Griffith is one of the key plot elements that I have.
But you introduce in the beginning 3 women, and all 3 are beautiful.
A 3. What's the
Abigail
third one?
Griffin.
Yeah. So
The problem is that I have no problem with beautiful women. That you want to suggest that?
well,
No.
anyway, the book I'm writing now, I have a really ugly woman defense attorney. Because I
like
was
to
getting
hear
sick and tired of having critics say that I have all these beautiful women in my, so I intentionally made her really ugly, and hopefully they'll get off my back. But,
No, but I think why not these beautiful? It has to do with believability.
Yeah.
And you said before,
It's a
your
made-up
characters
book.
have to be believable,
yeah.
and that also applies that doesn't only apply to their character, but also to their looks. I think.
Well, the books also have to be fun. You know, and one thing I like about writing is I can do what I want anyway. So, but no, really, when I'm writing the books, the only thing I'm really thinking about when I'm creating characters, what type of character will fit, and what characteristics do I need to fit into this particular plot. And I really don't do these things intentionally. And it wasn't until a couple of critics started remarking on the fact that all the women in the books are beautiful that I realized that was actually true. So. You know, that really was not intentional. It was because I thought it would really help the plot along to have that person have the certain facial characteristics. So, shoot me, kill me. I won't have any more beautiful women in any of my books ever, I promise.
Is there now perhaps a question from the audience? Yes, behind.
Yeah, first person's really limiting, and I sort of got into this with Hearthstone. Hearthstone has a lot of subplots, and so I had all these different points of view. And I have a friend of mine who's a writer, and he critiques my first drafts, and he hates that. He happens to write a series that it's all from the main characters in all the scenes. It's just my style. And I have so many subplots going on in these books that it really frequently helps me to be able to write that way. So it's just a quirk of my style, and I've talked with my friend about that a number of times. He says it's not fair to the reader because sometimes you don't give enough information, and I've thought about it. You know, I've thought about it really seriously, and I really don't. I've come to the conclusion that it's okay what I do. I don't think it hurts the reader. I think it helps the story. You know, it does disturb some people, and you know, if I thought that I wasn't doing, that I could improve what I was doing by changing it, I'd do it. But right now, I really feel comfortable with it. You know, so it's just a question of point of view of personal likes and dislikes.
There was somebody else who wanted to ask a question. Yes, over.
No, I write. I tell you this. I write for fun. I really write. I look on writing. I play a lot of chess and I do crossword puzzles. For me, writing a book is like solving a puzzle. I've got all these different things going on, and I'm trying to make it work. And so, I really am writing to a certain extent. For me, there are things that I want to put in because I want readers to be happy. I read a lot. And I try to write the type of book that I like to read. So I always have the surprise ending. I always have loads of plot twists, because when I read a mystery, I really want to be fooled. So those things I try to consciously put in. But I really try to do a book that I'm going to enjoy and something I get excited about. We were talking, I don't know if I was talking to Rene about this, but when Gone but Not Forgotten came out, it was a huge, really, really popular book. It was number 3 in the U.S. at one time and sold over 1 million copies. And the temptation was to write a second book with the same heroine, Betsy Tannenbaum, and also a serial killer in it. Because, if the second book got really popular, then I'd have this, big readership. And I intentionally didn't do that because I
Gone but Not Forgotten 2.
Yeah. And I intentionally didn't do that. I intentionally
part.
didn't write that because I didn't want to get pigeonholed and stereotyped and not be able to write the type of book I want to write. So I took a chance with After Dark, which is really a very bizarre love story, and wrote a book that's very different in tone. It has a surprise ending, it's got the twist, but it doesn't have the same tone. And I was hoping people would like it enough to to let me write different books. So each one of my books is really, they're all legal thrillers, they all have the surprise endings, but they have a totally different feel in each book. I get bored really easily. If I wrote the same book over and over again because I was trying to figure out the audience, I don't think they'd be good. I think they get bad, I get bored, and the books would get stale.
There's another question there and then there.
I was quite intrigued by your answer to the question you raised about whether the American jury system had anything to do with the success of the books. And you said no, you could imagine that it is something. I don't think so. I think it's a very fundamental difference between the two legal systems and also between society. As a matter of fact, I believe that the success of your books is very much linked to the fact that the American society is very litigious, is very much living with juries, and is very much interested in what's going on in relationships and legal effects of any conflict which arise. I don't think we would have much of a future in this society where we don't have juries, and where judges are extremely well and do their job and are professionals. So you miss all the excitement of the unexperienced juror coming in, being exposed to litigation, and all the effects which were raised and all the cases which were mentioned, etc. So I really think it has something to do with society, but I would like to hear your views on it.
Yeah, the point I was making is when you're a writer, one neat thing about being a writer, which I really like, is you have total control over the environment that you're working in, which was not true when I was a lawyer. You know, a lot of times things I want to have happen in the real world didn't happen. You know, when I was arguing in front of a judge and he rules against me, I have to say, oh, thank you, Your Honor, but when I can come home then write a scene where a judge turns down my hero's motion and he gets his head cut off in the next chapter is very cathartic. The point I was making is you can manipulate the existing system to inject fictitious elements that might not come up. My rule of thumb is if it could happen, you can put it in the book. So whereas, you know, again, I don't know the system at all. So maybe I'm just talking through my hat, and if I read, you know, a lot about it and sat in on a number of trials, I changed my opinion. But the book that I'm writing now, the one that I'm working on, which I hope will be finished in about a month, the main character is a judge who gets blackmailed. And, you know, that really, in Oregon, we have a really straight-arrow jury system. I mean, when we have a scandal, it's almost embarrassingly silly. It'll have something to do with the latest scandal we had with the police was that they were using their cell phones too much. I mean, you look at Chicago or LA or something where they're shooting people and bribing people, and that's what happens in Oregon. So I don't know any judges that have been bribed in the 25 years that I've been a lawyer in Oregon, but I made it up, you know, and that's with fiction, you have leeway as long as, I mean, I can't have the moon fall on somebody, you know, the bad guy's got the good guy holding a gun on him and the moon falls on him. That you can't do because it could never happen. But a Dutch judge could be bribed to reach a result. His family could be threatened. The defense attorney in the case might be offered a lot of money if he could win the case for someone involved with drugs, and he might do something evil.
So we can learn still a lot from the United States.
Yeah, you can corrupt this system.
There was a question over there.
Two questions. The first one is, do you enjoy writing?
Yeah, I love it. I just love, no, I'll tell you something, I am making a lot of money at it, but that's not why I write. I really love writing. I get up 7 days a week, I write. It's so much fun for me. And I really don't want to, I find it, there's some people from Mühlenhof here, put your hands over your ears. And my agent said, never say this, but I think it's, I sometimes shake my head that people are actually paying me to do this. Because I did it for quite a long time when I wasn't getting paid anything, because I just like it, you know, so it's fun. And I like the fact that I'm also able to make a living at it. That's neat. But I think most writers, the vast majority of writers don't make a lot of money at it. So I think most people who do it because it's fun. They enjoy doing it.
And the second one, when you start your speech, you told us that writing is a profession. You have to learn it. So where did you get it?
No, I said it, not that it is a profession. I said it's like any other learned activity, like tennis. When you start playing tennis, you could be the best tennis player who ever lived. The first time you get a racket in your hand, you're not going to even get the ball over the net. But you have to work at it. And same thing with writing. The first novel I wrote was horrible. The second novel I wrote was ghastly. But I kept on working at it, and eventually you get better and better. It's like with anything else. What I was trying to say is don't get discouraged or somehow think that all writers naturally come to writing. There are some people who are geniuses, I'm sure, that write beautifully the very first time they try it. But there might be there's some very good writers in the present too, but I'm saying most people who are writers are not like that. Most people who are writers had to work real hard at what they were doing to get good. And I think what's unfortunate is most people who don't write somehow think that the majority of writers have these mystical abilities that just sort of come to them. And at least I know for sure that didn't happen to me. I really had to put in my hours. And most people that I know that are successful had a lot of failures before they could actually write the book that was published.
Okay, I have a question on quite another aspect of working, writing first. Was there a question still?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I just wondered, it's disappointing that you must feel when you have something that you think is okay or good enough to publish. How did you take that initiative? What kept you going?
Because I like writing. I don't know, I always ask people this question. Do you play golf or do you play bridge? Do you get paid for it? Why are you doing this? It's the same thing for me. It's fun. It's always been a hobby. The writing's just a fun thing that I do, and it's the same thing if someone's out on the golf course 8 hours on a weekend. Why are they doing that? Because it's really fun to do. If you go skiing, why are you skiing? You're not getting paid to ski. So for me, it's the reason I stuck with it when I wasn't successful was because I didn't care one way or the other. I was just having a lot of fun doing it. I always looked at it as something that I did on the weekends. My main job was being a lawyer. That's where I earned my living. I like that too.
But the comparison, I think, is not quite right in the sense that when you are skiing is skiing, going down a mountain, that's it. But writing is for some people only writing when it results in a book that's being published.
Well,
when there is some object that is being produced. And that's quite different from playing tennis or playing golf.
What I always advise people when I talk about writing is never write to get published and never write for money. Because most people, it's very hard to break in. And a lot of times people can work and not get published. And then if you do get published, you don't make money. If you're going to write just to get published or make money, you might be unhappy. But if you write because you have a really good time doing it and you're doing it for fun, then even if you never get published, you'll have as much enjoyment as people who do get published.
But isn't your experience that most people who want to write books ask you, how do you get your feet between the door and the publisher's house?
And I try to explain how they can improve their writing, but I also always caution them, don't think like that. Because I have had 5 books published that became bestsellers, and I've had a bunch published that were a bunch written that were never published, and I liked writing them as much. The first novel I wrote, which never got published, I enjoyed writing that as much as I enjoyed Gone But Not Forgotten. I didn't know Gone was going to become a big bestseller. So I wrote it because I was having a good time doing it. And really, if you have that mental attitude, you can't lose.
You said before intermission that you thought the clue at the very end was very important.
Mm-hmm.
You and Rene, who's also a thriller writer, have the same ideas about that.
I don't know what your ideas. I don't. You have to answer that.
Sometimes I have the clue in the beginning, or the outline of the story, or the end, or the twists in the plot. But generally, I haven't got them because I develop the plot, I develop the story from the characters. I start with characters and they have kind of confrontation, they live together, they have a kind of relation, and there's a confrontation or they collide with each other. And from that collisions, and often it's a very good thing to have a third party because it gives you more possibilities for interactions. And from that interactions I develop the story. So that there's one novel I wrote and I only knew what would happen in the first 5 pages. And after that I didn't know anything, not at all.
We talked about this yesterday, and it's really a matter of style. You know, again, when I read books, my favorite writers are like Ellery Queen and Ross MacDonald, who have clues and then they have a surprise solution at the end, and I like that. So I try to develop that style because it's fun for me. But there's no right way of doing a thriller. I mean, if it works, it works. So you can have totally different styles. For me, I love to have a shock at the end. I like to have a surprise at the end because that's the way I like to write.
Are there other questions from the audience? Yes.
Despite our differences in the law system, earlier mentioned jury system and everything, Dutch law matters are also getting very popular in Holland. Just all these TV series and a lot of reality TV on all law matters. So I think it's possible to make it exciting and make it fantastic. A very strange thing in what you were saying, I think, is what you think it's unfortunate that people are getting the wrong idea about the legal system, and you're helping us to get the wrong idea. But anyway, let's decide that. I think it's very controversial. The question was actually, how do you think, I think the height of the legal system was a bit earlier in the United States than in Holland. What do you think the reasons are for this kind of hype of all this interest in legal methods? Because there's also the hospital methods, hospital series, and also legal series. What is the interesting thing about lawyers? And I mean, I think it's
you know, you have in a murder case, for instance, most people are law-abiding citizens. You know, they get up in the morning, they do the right thing, they go to work, they take care of their family, they don't shoot people, and they don't steal from people.
Even not in the United States.
Well, different in the United States. We all do that. No. But I mean, so there's a fascination with people who break the law, who don't go by the rules of society. So when you're reading about a thriller involving a murder, a court case involving a murder, it's sort of giving you a peek. The same reason you might go to the zoo to see a dangerous animal. There's curiosity. You can get close to the animal. It won't kill you, but you can see it. And so you're reading about what type of person would take a human life. Well, I think there's. Well, again, there's a curiosity about someone who could work with somebody who's killed somebody. How could you do that? I get that question all the time. How could you represent someone who killed somebody? How could you do it? What if you knew they were? And I think people, it's the same curiosity. I'm curious about other people's jobs. A physicist, or I don't do that job.
Even a linguist, perhaps.
Linguist, very fascinating. Linguist. So I think it's people who are not practicing the profession of law, are curious about it, sounds interesting to them, and this is a sort of a gateway that they can use to get into reading about what it's like to be a lawyer. You meet all these beautiful women all the time.
Of course, we know that. But all of your books have a kind of happy ending in the sense that evil is punished. Isn't that a little bit simplistic? I even say it's kind of bourgeois approach to what's going on in the world.
I like the bad guys to get their just desserts, and I also think, and this is my own personal opinion, I don't enjoy a lot of books where the bad guy gets away with it, because sometimes that shows me that the writer wasn't willing to put in the work to try to figure out a clever way of getting the bad guy. it's pretty easy out to just let the bad guy get away with it.
Oh, no, I don't think
No,
that.
I don't want to get you
the
mad.
The bad guy can also be very clever to escape.
Yeah.
And the writer can put that in also.
Right, but
also very
it's
difficult.
got to be clever.
Of
And
course,
that's
it's
my
gotta be clever,
my
yeah,
point.
yeah.
So
Even cleverer than a lawyer.
yeah, there could be a lot of people who clever. But so the point for me personally, and again, it's just personal preference.
Yeah.
I like good to win the end. I like bad guys to be punished, and so that's the way I like to end them. I don't enjoy books where the bad guy gets away. So occasionally, it's fun if it is a very clever way that the bad guy beats the system. Usually in those books, the bad guy isn't really a bad guy, though. He's usually a good bad guy, and you want to sort of root for him and hope he gets away. And for my personal preference, at least in the books I've written, I like the evil fella to get his just desserts.
So, for instance, you don't like the Ripley books by Patricia Highsmith?
I haven't read them.
You haven't read them?
I heard them, but I haven't read them.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
There was a question there.
Why weren't you bothered by household noises or family duties or time limitations?
Well, first of all, I'm really supportive. My wife and kids are really supportive. Secondly, like I said, I got up early, and they were sleeping. So that's why I got up at 7, or in the morning. I get up like at 6.
You drug them, or?
No, they just sleep late. They sleep late.
And then you stop at 12? I mean,
11 o'clock.
when you're in the middle of a sentence or
Yeah.
story?
Well, you know what happens to me? I'm really intense when I write, and I get tired. Yeah, I work for. This is when I was a lawyer too. I could get.
You set yourself a limitation.
No, I just get tired. I used to, even with a lawyer, I would get a huge amount done in a very small amount of time, and then I sort of burn myself out. So sometimes I'll have days where I work all day, but it's really unusual. Usually by 11 o'clock, I want to do something else, and I don't feel like I'm fresh anymore, like I'm really doing good work. So that's it.
Other questions over there?
I have to ask a question, one more thing. How do you go about choosing the names of your heroes?
This is kind of the phone book. Well, a lot of times it's really not very. It's embarrassing. Lots of times I'll pick friends' names and mix and match. And I've actually had people, some of my friends, lobby me to get in the books successfully. I use the phone book. Lists, I'm a member of the U.S. Chess Federation. We get Chess Life, and they have a lot of foreign names in there because a lot of chess players are from Russia and all over the place. So I use those chess players' names for foreign names and stuff. So it's really not very...
No Dutch names?
I don't know if I have a Dutch name. I'll put a Dutch name in it. I'll put a Dutch name in the next book.
So I can read my name in your next book.
Rene Appel, the psychopath.
Who gets away in the end? You had a second question, you said.
You describe scenes of violence very effectively. You feel like you're there. How do you go about writing like
Well, you got to remember, for 25 years, I did lunch with guys who killed people. So I've read lots of autopsies, I've seen pictures of a lot of dead bodies, and discussed, people killing people with a lot of people over the years. So what I've done is just personal experience, writing from personal experience. I haven't killed anyone yet, but except a couple of judges I would like to as close to. But that's basically it. I mean, I've done I have autopsy reports. I have police reports from my cases that I can. Plus, I'm friendly with the former state medical examiner, and if I want to check to make sure that what I'm doing is correct, I'll give it to him, or I'll call him up and say, okay, I want to have this and this happen. I want the person to be stabbed. Tell me what the wounds are going to look like. If this happens, if that happens, tell me what would happen. With the Burning Man, there's a fellow gets set on fire, and I went and consulted with an expert on treating burn victims at the medical school, and he gave me detailed description of how you would treat the burns and what they would look like. And he showed me pictures and that type of thing. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because many Dutch thriller writers also write about these violent things where people are stabbed or are beaten to death, and always think, how do they know what happens when they write about it? And I think they don't know what really happens. It's just a fantasy. And there was a question over there.
I was just wondering how you come up with the name and whether is it a big marketing gesture?
Oh,
Or
no.
do you decide the name yourself?
Yeah, the names sort of like come to me through the air. It's really, I mean, Hearthstone just popped into my head one day, and a lot of times the books go through several titles before I'll have a working title, and it'll take me a while before something strikes me. Gone but Not Forgotten started out with a really bad title, The Crime of the Century or something. It was really awful. And then I was writing the book, and I wrote the note. You know, the serial killer leaves the note on the pillow with the black rose that says "Gone but Not Forgotten." I said, "Hey, that's why don't I use that for the title? That make a pretty good title." So that, you know, it's never. I've always picked the title. My publishers never picked the title. I've talked with about it. The Burning Man, I had a couple of tentative titles that I really didn't like, and I sort of floated them by. But the actual choice in each case has been mine.
But why the Burning Man? Because he's not the main character of the book.
Well, he is, because Peter burns. His in the very first part of the book, the very first chapter, Peter's career goes up in flames.
That's your
And he's sort of
metaphorical way, yeah.
Yeah, I'm a literary writer too.
Yeah,
I got symbols in my books.
and there, that's a point I want to discuss with you. Here in Holland, thriller writers often complain. They think they don't get the respect they deserve. They are not taken seriously in the literary world. And what is your opinion about that? How's the situation in the United States? Is it quite different from here in Holland? In Holland, there's made a distinction. On the one hand, you have the respected literary authors, and on the other hand, you have the thriller writers.
Well, I think one part of that's pretty similar. I think in the States there's a division between people who are perceived as literary writers, and then people who are perceived as thriller writers or science fiction writers, romance writers. I think one thing that's different is I think thriller writers are getting a lot of respect now. I'd say maybe 20 years ago, they were sort of the only writer was someone who wrote very serious contemporary fiction, whereas mystery writers were somehow not worthy of respect. I think that's changed in the States a lot.
But why has it changed?
I think it's just a recognition that a book's a book. If you have someone who writes, I mean, I don't know how many of you read Snow Falling on Cedars.
Yes, I have.
What is that? Is that a courtroom thriller? I think so. You know, it happens to be very well written. It's got a lot of elements that you may not find in every thriller, but it's a courtroom. It's a murder, and there's a trial. Yeah. And To Kill a Mockingbird, what is that? It's a courtroom thriller. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think we should take a look at each book individually on its merits. And there is some literary fiction that I think is really boring and awful, where the writer doesn't pay any attention to plotting, spends all his time writing beautiful sentences, which are 10 times better than what I can write, but doesn't bother about believable characters or a plot. And the really, really great writers like Conrad and Shakespeare, they had the whole ball of wax. They wrote beautifully. They had terrific plots that kept you on the edge of your seat. You want to find out what's going to happen next. And they had really believable characters. And you can have that in a thriller, you can have it in a good literary novel, or you can have a contemporary novel that people are pushing as being wonderful literature that really is very boring and dull, and it may hit on one of the three spokes. It might be well written, or maybe it has a good character, but it doesn't have a plot. And I think you have to take a look at each book on its merits, and not just clump books together because it happens to be science fiction and say, oh, if it's science fiction, it's not worthy of reading. You know, it may be that a particular book isn't, but then if you just form your opinion that way, you're going to miss out on a lot of very good books. So, you know, that's my personal feeling about it. And I love to read. I mean, I read classics. I read very, very good contemporary fiction, and I love a really good story. I love the shipping news, and I like, Joseph Conrad and Thomas Hardy are among my favorite writers. And I can see differences, a lot of difference between the way they write and the way I write in a lot of areas. But if you want to see a guy, they say the first thing you do in a thriller, grab your reader. Well, you read Thomas Hardy and you'll see a guy who grabs his reader. He writes just like thriller writers. He hooks you in the first chapter, and you've got to keep turning the pages to find out what's going to happen. And that's very common in thrillers, too. So a lot of the elements cross over.
Any more questions? The audience is over there. No, I love to read. I'm almost, it's almost an illness. I think my kids and my wife would say that it's a sign of mental illness. I read about 1 to 3 books a week, and I read them just because I love to read. I really enjoy reading, and I've always enjoyed reading. And I compartmentalize. I read while I'm writing. I'll be writing writing a book, and I'll take a coffee break and read somebody else's book. And one of the things, I don't know whether it's senility or what, but I don't remember the plots. So sometimes I read them 2 or 3 times, which is good because I know if I like them or not. So I can come back and reread them, but I don't, when I'm writing. It's like with my law. When I'm doing law, and then when I'm doing writing, I don't think about the law. And if I'm reading a book, I'm not thinking about law or my writing. Have you been rereading your books?
No.
Have you recently read Gone But Not Forgotten?
This is really embarrassing.
That's why I asked the question, of course. Because
of the way I write, these are projects for me. And once I'm finished with it, I want to do something else. And so a lot of times I forget the plots or the characters. And every once in a while I have to reread a book, say it's in hardback, and then I have to read the draft of the paperback to make sure there aren't typos or some mistakes. And I won't remember things that are in the book. So, that's just the way I am. So I do reread them, and sometimes they surprise me.
Mm-hmm. So. There was a question over there at the back.
I'm just curious to know how your clients have connected to
The clients?
Your clients and your partners.
My partner is my wife.
Oh, you don't work in a law firm?
Yeah, I work in a law firm. It's me and my wife. The whole firm's here if you want to sue somebody. Yeah, we can sue you. I don't know. My clients, I'll give you an example. I've just been asked to go down to the Oregon State Penitentiary and address the Lifers Club about how to write. My client's been really supportive. And it's cute. Every once in a while I get a letter from someone who's at a federal penitentiary or state penitentiary saying that they read my book and they thought it was really neat. So, it's been really nice. The lawyers in Oregon have been really supportive also. It's been a very nice experience for me.
You're specifically specialized in criminal law?
Yeah, that's the only thing I like. I do a lot of appeals. I've done about 80 appeals. I've argued in the U.S. Supreme Court and Oregon Supreme Court about 12, 15 times. But most of my cases are criminal. I've tried other areas. I just don't like them. They just don't get me excited.
But people who are just in criminal cases, that could be lawyers or defendants, don't they think he uses the information to make money out of it with his books?
No, I did. The only book that I ever based on one of my cases is The Burning Man. And before I did that, I asked the family and the fellow that was involved in the case if they would mind, and I let him read the first draft of the book to see if he had any problems with it, because I didn't want to. They just thought it was great. I dedicate the book to the defendant and the family, So but I wouldn't. I've used incidents from things I've done in court. Like in the Last Innocent Man, there was something I used in a court case to win an acquittal that had to do with photography, and so I used that in the book, but it's not the same situation. It's not the same situation in general, but has nothing to do with the case that I was trying.
Matthew Reynolds. It was with Matthew Reynolds in the book. Oh, it was not after
No,
that.
this is Last Innocent Man.
One last question, perhaps? Yes?
okay, I lived in West Africa for 2 years in a dictatorship, and if the government didn't like you, they would come in the middle of the night and take you away. And you didn't get a right to a lawyer, you didn't get a right to tell your side of the story. And that made me a big fan of the rule of law. In our system in the States, and I think it's a little bit similar here, if the government is going to accuse somebody of wrongdoing and wants to take his or her liberty away, we put the burden on the government to back up their words. And my job in the system, which is more important than any individual case, is to make sure that the prosecution and the judge are following the rules and not cheating. I also play a very important part in situations where my clients are innocent. You know, most of the clients aren't in real life, but I do every once in a while get some who actually even do what they're accused of. And then that's an even further job of making sure that the system's working. Yeah, I think one of the things that I really like best about American society is the fact that we have this this system that's set up to try to protect people from being mistreated. And it doesn't always work because you're never going to have a perfect system. The American system is not perfect, no system is. But I feel it's a really important job to make sure. And it's most important when the person's horrible. You know, you look at Timothy McVeigh, who's on trial now, and he's, you know, most people, if you'd asked them, you know, if he blew up the building, what would you like to see happen to him? They probably would personally like to shoot him. If you can give that type of person a fair trial, that means everyone in the society can get a fair trial. So the most important types of cases are the ones where the defendant is the most horrible, the least deserving of pity, because that really is the test of the system, how it handles the worst cases. So that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the system, and why I like being a criminal defense lawyer, is an opportunity to be part of a system that does protect people from hopefully being mistreated. I'm not always happy about, I mean, you know, this is what I try to explain to people. There's two sides. There's the lawyer side and there's the human side, okay? If I'm representing somebody and he's acquitted for a crime that he really did, but he's acquitted because everybody in the system, you know, the prosecution didn't prove its case, the jurors followed the rules of law and found the person innocent because they didn't feel that the case had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm very happy that the system's working. I may not feel happy as a person. I've had a number of cases where I represented really awful people who got off, and I didn't feel good about it. I didn't go running around saying, hey, this is great. I left the courtroom feeling pretty depressed, you know, because as a person, I don't like to see this type of individual get off. But as a lawyer, I felt very proud that the system had worked. And I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding this dual sort of a schizophrenic personality that a lot of people in this system have to, you know, sort of put up with.
You just said that somebody gets off guilty, the system works, the system doesn't work.
It did work if the reason he was acquitted is that the state couldn't carry its burden of proof. What's important, at least in our system, again, you have to look historically. When the colonies broke free from the British, what we were doing was breaking free from what we saw was extremely bad, oppressive government. So when we wrote our system, and I'm not saying this is the best way to do it, I'm saying this is the way we do it. We wrote all of our rules in the criminal justice system from the viewpoint that you can't trust government, that government's bad, that government will accuse you of things you didn't do, and that it's evil. So we put a lot of barriers between the government and a person who's accused of crime. And then before the person's liberty can be taken away, we really weight things for the citizen. We say you have to prove the fellow did it, you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that a juror can feel in his heart and in his mind that the person's guilty. But if they have one doubt that came from legally admitted evidence that makes them say, wait a second, it does look like he did it, but boy, this one piece of evidence makes me think he's innocent. And if the state can't erase that doubt and it's based on reason, not some silliness, then the juror's duty under our system is to acquit. So it's not inconsistent to have a juror believe that the person committed the crime and find them not guilty. Not guilty really means not proven. Okay? So in that case, the system's working because the jury followed the rules and didn't let their emotions guide them. And one thing I point out is I've had a number of people who didn't commit. I've had a couple of people who were innocent who were convicted of crimes like murder. And that really scares me. So you want to make sure that the system's working as well as you can to avoid having good people punished.
I think indeed good people don't deserve punishment. I think you deserve an applause.
Thank you.